Are live again. Hi, Tom. How are you
Hi,
today?
how's it going?
I'm good. I'm
Good.
good. So, for the people who are attending for the first time, let's introduce ourselves briefly and then we'll get started. Today's subject is about viability and feasibility. So, that's going to be an interesting discussion. Tom, first, introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I am Tom Clement, and I am an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship at Minnesota State University, Mankato, which is about an hour south of Minneapolis in the state of Minnesota. And I primarily teach entrepreneurship along with creativity and innovation. And I'm happy to be with you today. Inge?
Great. So my name is Inge de Dreu in Dutch. It's very hard to pronounce in other languages, unfortunately. I've worked with entrepreneurs and also with entrepreneurship education with a couple of universities, both in Colombia and also in the Netherlands. From that experience, I've developed the Playground for Entrepreneurs, which is a coaching tool, a very fun, serious game to play with entrepreneurs or students of entrepreneurship. Um, so that is what I am basically doing today. What I'm basically doing right now, really. So let's get started with feasibility and viability. And we were just discussing an interesting case, Tom, about a very media, very much in the media today, Theranos, right?
Yes, Theranos, a really interesting case and story. And of course, Elizabeth Holmes, the founder, just reported to prison. It was about 2 months ago or a month and a half ago or so, and started serving her sentence. I think she got 11 years, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
So that was a company that, or an idea, a solution that would be able to take uh, blood drops, just a couple drops of blood in a vial, and be able to test it for a wide variety of different illnesses and viruses and things like that using a machine called the Edison, which was really about the size of a large computer printer. And you'd put the vial into the machine, and it would run the tests for you and give you the results with just a pinprick instead of using a syringe and a needle, which a lot of people are scared of. They have a lot of anxiety about having blood drawn like that, and the whole concept behind it was really good. And you talk about viability, there was definitely product market fit there. So
Yeah.
there was customers out there that were interested in it.
Look at only the amount of investors that they've had interested. And those are big names. Those are not just first time investors who just had a lot of money on their bank account just because. Those were very big names who know about entrepreneurship. They all convinced them, right? They all convinced them. That's viability. So the viability is, can you find a market for it? Well, they did. They were well on their way. They were able to convince all those investors. They would have been able, without a doubt, to actually get customers as well. And now feasibility, which is a kind of different story, right?
It's a very different story. And the way I explain it to my students is viability is, should we do it? So are there customers out there or a market out there that's willing to purchase it? But then when you get into feasibility, we're talking about, can we do it? And it's interesting, if you watch some of the Theranos documentaries, Elizabeth Holmes attended Stanford University, and there was a particular professor that she visited and explained this whole concept of the Edison device to her. And she had some medical background, and she tried to explain to Miss Holmes that this is just never going to work. It's just not going to work. There's no technological way to be able to test for all of those different things with one single machine, just because of all the logistics involved in it. So the feasibility was in question from the very beginning, and obviously that all worked out to be the case. There's a really interesting HBO documentary. It's quite long. It's almost 3 hours long, about the whole Theranos thing. And it was really, beyond the idea or the solution itself, it was really quite a debacle what they went through to try to gain feasibility
Yes.
with it. So that's the big difference. And a lot of people confuse feasibility and viability, the terms. They kind of think that they mean the same thing. And obviously, definitionally, they don't. But in the context of startups, they're really quite different things.
And feasibility is really about, can we do it? So they weren't able to do it. Now, of course, Theranos took it to a different level, right? So every honest, sincere person would have at some point given up, right?
Right.
And they didn't, and that is why she is in prison right now, because there was a lot of frauds, there was a lot of lies, there was a lot of very big lies. I think there was also a tour of, at that point, Vice President Joe Biden through a lab that wasn't actually with their equipment. And a couple of things just like that. So they just took it to another level. That's not a case of feasibility anymore. That's just fraud.
Correct. And it was unprecedented in a lot of ways, because if you look back at the early 2000s and even the late 90s with all the different .com ideas that failed, that demonstrated that you can lose hundreds of millions of dollars when you transfer energies from the viability to the feasibility stage, that it's just not possible to make things happen. I even joke with my students that, I'm an early eBay user, and back in the early days of eBay, we used to mail paper checks to each other, because the online payment system using credit cards was not perfected yet at that point. You could do it, but a lot of people were not trusting of the system. They were concerned about putting their credit card numbers out there, as they still are today. But this was back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So there's lots and lots of examples of sort of the difference between viability and feasibility. Do you want to start with one of yours beyond Theranos? You had another one with a grocery store app that you talked to me about.
Yes, there was an entrepreneur that I've met in Colombia. He actually had a successful company. He was an architect, but at some point he wanted to start a different company, and he thought, well, grocery shopping, and how cool would it be to be able to compare every individual product that you buy, right? So, well, if we talk about the US, there's Walmart, there's Whole Foods, and there might be a couple of other chains depending on where you are. And you want to buy a product, and you compare the same product in the 3 different stores, and you put it in the cart of the store, whichever suits you best for that individual product, whether it's the cheapest or a better quality, or whichever you choose. So you end up with 3 carts at different stores, and with one click on a button, you just buy everything, and you probably get it sent to your house from 3 different supermarkets. How cool would that be?
That would be super convenient.
Yes, very super convenient. And a lot of people thought so, because the first day he had about 100 customers. The second day he had 800 or 900. The third day he needed to close. Why did he need to close? Because all the lawyers of the different supermarkets just jumped on him and told him to close. And now supermarket chains have very deep pockets, have a lot of money, and an individual entrepreneur, although he was a successful businessman, his pockets were definitely not as deep as these supermarket chains. So even though legally he could be kind of in the correct, there was no way of, well, each of those supermarkets had their catalog online anyway. He just wasn't able to do it, because supermarkets don't like that, right? Somebody comes out the worst. So supermarkets don't like being compared with each other on each different individual product.
If you travel back,
it was an interesting story, because that's in terms of interest from the market and the users, there's no problem there. he would probably be able to charge maybe a subscription or a commission or something, just to be able to do that comparison, because you would get your grocery shopping cheaper anyway, right? So he
Right.
would be able to charge for that, even if it was just a small piece. With hundreds of thousands, millions of customers, that would have made it viable already. Now, in terms of feasibility, well, technologically he could make it, but legally he couldn't, right?
Right.
So that's where the problem stuck. So that's the point where you can't do something, where there's some sort of obstacle. It's not usually not for the major parts of the companies that this type of obstacle counts, but for some very specific ideas, it's really essential, because that's where your startup either gets made or broken, really.
I was watching the chat here, and we had one LinkedIn user chime in and say viability, is it theoretically possible? And feasibility is, can we turn that possibility or that theory into reality? And that's another really great way to sort of describe that. I also want to say hello to our LinkedIn users, Nigel and John and Kareem and Nelly and Bilal, joining us from all parts unknown right now. I know where a few folks are from. John is one of my colleagues at MSU, so thank you for joining us. But this goes back to, if you take your mind back to your economics class, it's the classic oligopoly, which is a great word in the case of the grocery app that you're talking about, where you've got an industry that's very tightly controlled by a few very large players, and they create these barriers to entry for entrepreneurs. And that can be another feasibility problem that a lot of entrepreneurs face. Even, you go back 40, 50 years ago, I'm not even necessarily sure it would have been possible for Elon Musk to do what he did with electric vehicles back then, because there was such a tight oligopoly between the auto manufacturers, especially the big three in America, which were Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. They were able to set up these barriers to entry. But the good news for entrepreneurs is a lot of those barriers and those oligopolies have started to slowly break down over time.
Yeah.
You saw it in the computer industry with Apple taking on IBM, for example, back in the early 80s, especially. And that's sort of just grown over time. And they were really, really able to win that game in many ways. And you look at other examples of feasibility and viability. I think about some of the college students that I've had in my classes, where you'll teach an entrepreneurship class to a college student, and a lot of times they come up with very college student centric ideas. One example I can think of was, I was teaching at a school for a number of years where they had a ride sharing program on campus to move students around. The trouble was, it wouldn't go off campus for liability purposes, I'm sure. So if you had a student downtown at a bar that had too much to drink, they were not able to get a ride back to campus unless they got an Uber, or they hitched a ride with one of their friends, or they called a cab. And so the students came up with a really nice ride sharing program that would go both on and off campus. The trouble was, they didn't want to require the students to have to pay for it. So the campus would have to chip in some of the dollars that it would take to subsidize this program. And the campus sort of didn't really have it in the budget, and they didn't really want to either, because, again, I'm sure they were concerned about liability issues and things like that. And so they sort of put the hex on that idea in that particular case. So that's another good example.
And I've seen that very much also with, for example, people who wanted to develop an application to see when the bus is coming. So especially in Colombia, buses come when they want to, right? Not when the schedule is due. So they always wanted to. Was a lot of teams, and I'm talking about several tens there, who wanted to create an application to see when the bus is coming and if it's full or if they can get a seat. Right now, this if you do normal customer discovery interviews with the users, you'll find this is a very big problem, right? Because everybody needs to go in a bus. It's full. So it's very frustrating to be on the bus, and it's also very frustrating not to know when the bus comes. So it's a very big problem. The thing is, nobody is willing to pay for that, right? So they're
Right.
expecting the bus companies to pay for it, and the bus companies, they don't care, right? They don't care. If it's the bigger bus companies, they are very elitist, maybe, or there might be some corruption there. If it's the smaller bus companies, they just don't think about their customers in a customer friendly way, and they just want their buses filled up as much as possible and then to drive to the other end of town. That's what they want, as to sell as many tickets as they can possibly. They are not going to pay for that because they don't care if the customer knows, if their user knows when the bus is coming, and if the bus is full, because they want to sell as many tickets as possible. And there's another couple of ideas that have the same kind of problem, that is really a revenue model problem, because the problem is very clear. The thing is that nobody is really willing to pay for it. So the person who's supposed to pay for it doesn't experience the problem as such.
It's really a competition thing too. I mean, you get into an industry where there's less competition, you know, in the case of these buses, for example, where they know the buses are going to be full regardless of what they do. That changes the thinking a lot when you're trying to do what is in essence, in this case, an add-on to an already existing industry, to try to get an industry, to compel an industry to change the way they do business. You have to take a look around and see what kind of competition there is out there and what kind of regulation there is. And I think about, I go
Okay.
back, I was able to attend a UAV summit, an unmanned aerial vehicle summit. People are familiar with drones, probably more common term used in that space. And the summit was really interesting because there was all these vendors and booths set up with all these really great drone related ideas, where you could go up and inspect the roof of a home, for example, or you could do a payload drop. There was crop inspection, where you could go out and inspect a field with a drone instead of having to fly over it in an airplane or walk the field manually. Just all kinds of really great ideas, aerial photography. But none of this was possible yet because the FAA had not, the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, had not freed up the airspace necessary to be able to fly these drones legally. There was
Yeah.
people using them illegally, but for commercial purposes, it's important that you stay legal. And they were not able to use these yet. And then shortly after that event that I attended, within the next 2 to 3 years, slowly that started to change and it started to open up. And now, of course, there's
Yeah.
UAV and drone related businesses all over the place. And that industry has really thrived and grown. So again, the viability was there. There was definitely, for example, farmers out there that would love to take a drone and go out and do a crop inspection without having to manually walk the fields.
Yeah.
But the feasibility just wasn't there because it wasn't possible to be able to do that.
Yeah, there's a very big time related issue there, right? In terms of feasibility. Sometimes it's legislation, sometimes it's technology, but that really impacts feasibility, if you can actually do it or not, if you can make it work or not. And in that case, well, there might be a lot of lobby going on, and eventually they will have to change, right? Because the drones at a certain time, they will have to probably.
Right.
Although taking a look at Uber, in some countries that might take a very long time.
That was another example. You and I discussed the fact that I wasn't even
Yes.
aware that in a lot of countries, I shouldn't say I was aware that that there was a lot of countries where it wasn't possible, but I wasn't aware of the specific countries. And you
Yep.
named a few of them to me where you can't even use an Uber because it's
Yeah.
not legal.
No, it's not legal. So, and that's really strict. Like in the Netherlands, we don't use Uber. I think there's a couple of other European countries where it's just forbidden. And I remember in Colombia we used it quite a lot. So it really it really depends on the country, and that's also a feasibility issue, right? At the time in Colombia, when Uber came out, I was working for the Ministry of ICT, so I was quite close to the source of it. There was a lot of discussion about it at the time. The thing is that in the end, Colombia kind of decided that there was no stopping this anyway. Colombians use a lot of taxis. They need a lot of transportation, which is very different in the Netherlands. We use bicycles and trains. So but that's something that the Colombian government decided that it was time to allow it, right? So they needed to make the legislation in order to make it work. In the Netherlands, it's still not legal, and I think there's quite a lot more countries that are just like that.
And a lot of it depends on how strictly the rules are enforced as well. I mean, in the United States, for example, when Uber first started to become popular, your automobile insurance usually had a line written in your insurance policy where you could not use your vehicle for hire. In other words, you could not be paid by someone to use your vehicle to deliver either people or goods in that fashion. But it wasn't tightly restricted and tightly regulated. And a lot of those rules have since changed. The insurance companies have sort of come around to the fact that people are using their vehicles. But insurance is a big thing too. You think about the ability to be able to insure yourself as an entrepreneur to do certain things. And there's, with technology moving as quickly as it is, there's just certain things that just haven't kept up with the times. I think about legal. For example, in the United States, you can own a medical practice and not be a doctor. So I could come as an entrepreneur and start, for example, a dental practice and then just hire a bunch of dentists to come and work for me. Interestingly, in the legal profession, that's not possible in many of the United States. You cannot own a legal practice and not be a practicing licensed attorney. So there's a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities there with, for example, maybe online legal resources where you have to be a licensed practicing attorney to own a legal practice. Now, a few states have started to get rid of those laws, and you're starting to see some entrepreneurial opportunities opening up for folks out there. But these are all really great examples. And so I think we spend, again, I've talked about this before, and it's sort of one of my crusades, if you will, is we spend so much time focusing on the pre-startup activities of making sure an idea is viable. But we often don't spend enough time as educators talking to people about the feasibility of an idea. So we have a great solution. Lots and lots of people are interested in it and they're excited about it. But can we turn this into a business?
Yeah.
And that's one of the key problems that we face. And that could be something as complex as what we've just been talking about the last few minutes with laws and insurance and regulation. It could even be as simple as, can we even price this? How do we monetize this?
Yeah.
Or how do we sell it to somebody? Can we make the transaction work?
So just to resume, feasibility issues, you can kind of group them around if you can technologically do it, if you can legally do it, right? If you can price it or make money out of it. That's the three that we discussed, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and Tim and Nigel both bring up good points in the chat about greed. You get a large company like a Google or an Amazon, and a young entrepreneur is trying to start a business that competes with perhaps a segment of what these two large companies are doing, and they're able to sort of shut them out of the market by either being too price competitive or a variety of different ways that they can sort of, and again, that's that oligopoly sort of mentality where you're able to shut out different entrepreneurs, and that's a huge factor as well. Beyond just pricing and legal and regulation, is looking at, and I talk to my students about this, and I talk a lot about the business model canvas, but this is another way that you can use the canvas to think about your competitors in that space and how much are they going to come after you if you launch this particular venture.
That's what happened basically to the supermarket entrepreneur. Well, he got all of the lawyers jump on top of him, but they can also do it economically, right? They can just outcompete. If they've got very deep pockets, then
Right.
that's also a way to do the same thing.
If I decide to get into a certain segment of products, for example, and Amazon just decides we're just going to slash and burn and sell everything that we have for below cost, there's no way as a small retailer I can fully compete with that. You might get a few customers where there's a little bit of an Amazon backlash, but that's not going to necessarily be enough to sustain a business long term. And that's where the feasibility issues come in.
Yeah.
We were going to spend the last few minutes talking about sort of our favorite crashes.
Yes.
In the
so meanwhile, let's just ask the people who are attending. I see Nigel from the UK, Carlos from Mexico, and then I see another couple of people. Tim from the US, I think. With the supermarket entrepreneur, and this is a question of Dimitri, with the supermarket entrepreneur, what could he have done to be successful? In his case, at the point he was, he just needed to give up because there was no way out of it. These people were threatening him, and this was people with very deep pockets, with very successful, very well-paid lawyers, and he would just not be able to compete with that. So his idea basically was not feasible because of that. He needed to do something else. What he did was actually he just gave up. He went to his architecture business. I think he started to diversify that into different related businesses. But the supermarket idea of comparing individual products, that was just not, there was no way to make it work, really.
And the sad part about that is 2 years from now, it might fully succeed because enough time has passed and sort of the walls of resistance have broken down. We've seen this with dozens and dozens of .com type businesses and apps where there were these very early players in there that sort of were crushed by the industry, but then later on they were able to succeed in what, and this goes to my sort of favorite crash was pets.com. Pets.com was really the early online pet store where you could buy food and different things for your pet, but it was just a little bit too far ahead of its time. So great idea. People were interested in it, but the feasibility wasn't there because of shipping costs. The margins for dog food, for example, were not necessarily that great at the time where it could absorb the costs of shipping. So that was a great example of a business that was just a little bit too far ahead of its time. And now, of course, we have Chewy and all these different online pet food and pet supply websites that are very, very successful. But Pets was maybe just about 10 years too soon. And there was just a lot of feasibility issues surrounding it, not the least of which was technology and the ability to ship these products, which, you know, when you start talking about dog food and things like that, some of the products can be quite heavy. And those were some of the issues, and they weren't able to absorb that cost through their margins. They were just too early, as Dimitri comments in the comments in the chat, too early in a lot of cases.
Yeah, so actually, I remember having a team with just that same idea. They started with dog food, and they started to specialize at first at very heavy bags of dog food. Just because that would be a problem for people to get into their cars. They would have to drive to the store specifically to get the dog food and then go home. And they tried to solve that problem. It was Well, the problem there was more viability. It wasn't cost effective, right? They could never make
Right.
the revenue more than the cost, and that was the problem of it. But that's
Right.
definitely an interesting development that also time had a very big influence in in terms of supermarkets. Yes, I agree that at a certain point, although I think it still might be quite far away, sometimes things change very fast. That's true, but
Right.
supermarkets still don't like it to be compared on their individual products, right? You can probably get a cart at one supermarket and get a cart at another one, and then kind of compare the end results. But the individual product just to get three different grocery shopping bags delivered to your home, that's still far
Mhm.
away, I guess. So
We had one comment talking about desirability as sort of being the third leg of
yeah,
that stool, and I personally, and I don't know about you, Inga, but I would actually put desirability in with the viability question. When you're out trying to determine product market fit, desirability is a huge part of that. Are people desirous of a solution here? Do they
yep,
care enough? Or do they desire to go out and try to engage with what you're trying to supply them as a solution, product, service, whatever that might be? So I personally would put that under viability, but you could definitely look at it as
yeah,
a third element to consider.
definitely. I'd say that the viability is the financial aspect of it, right? So the desirability is if people want it, and the viability, yeah,
Emotional.
the emotional parts. And if you would want to do that, of course. But the viability is, can you make it work financially? And the largest part of it is, can I get enough people to pay me enough money to actually finance my cost? Right? Is that kind of within reach? Right? The exact calculation you can make it a bit later on, but is it within reach that you can get your costs covered? Because otherwise, it's just not viable. It's going to be a never ending black hole.
Well, and the feasibility then gets into the question of transaction. Can we transact this? Again, even though we have a dollar amount in mind that is viable, that will work for us, can we actually transact that with folks and with customers as we go forward? So looks like we're out of time already.
Yes,
These sessions
very
go
quickly.
quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was great to see everybody here today, all the people in the chat. Thank you for joining us here. Nigel, we
Yes,
will take a look at your example from the UK about supermarkets. That will take a minute, but we'll do that.
we can revisit
Yes.
that on a future episode.
And it was great talking with you today, Tom.
Great talking with you too. It's always fun to talk with you because we come up with some interesting exchanges of
Yes.
ideas. So
So looking
excellent.
forward to the next one. So please, if you haven't done so already, follow both of us on LinkedIn. Tom is frequently producing articles and also videos about entrepreneurship. He's done a lot of articles about entrepreneurship in general, and right now he's focusing more on sophomore entrepreneurs. And as for myself, I publish like general things about entrepreneurship, but also about the game, and the game as a way to progress your ideas and to get more of an innovative, a playful touch into your ideas. So, looking forward to connecting, and have a great day. Thank you for attending.
Take care. Bye bye.